Welcome, everyone, to episode 77 of Underserved. With me in studio today is Michael Gallagher, Principal Consultant within Solution Ownership at Slalom Build. Let's get started.
Welcome to this week's edition of Underserved, the podcast for the rest of the tech industry, where we focus on stories of tech industry leaders, their insights, and their lessons learned. And now, your host, Andrew Jelina.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today on Underserved.
Yeah, of course, Andrew. Really great to be here. I've been looking forward to coming in and talking with you and kind of sharing my story.
So way back when you're growing up, not a ton of technology on the old paper route, right?
No, absolutely not. Just to date myself, back in the 70s, growing up, little to no technology, really, pre-computers for the most part, mainstream anyway. I remember black and white TV. I remember our first color TV. So to that end, just not a lot of technology out there.
And are you delivering like a paper route where it's free and you're getting paid 3 cents a paper?
Yeah, no,
you have to collect?
Back then, everything, it was completely transactional, currency, coinage, you name it. And we were agnostic, come from a huge family. So we had these massive paper routes, whether it was the Globe or the Herald American. I remember the merger of them becoming down to just two. Back at that time, there was still silver floating around, so the clad coinage was out, but, I'd be finding all kinds of silver, Mercury had dimes, Washington quarters, pre-65, silver certificates, and so forth. So kind of took an interest in some of the coinage, more directly some of the precious metals that were still floating around out there.
Yeah, not a lot of that these days.
No.
So you're building up a coin collection and amassing some silver. How does this lead to you discovering a metal detector?
Yeah, like I said, there was, little to no computers out there, especially in the mainstream. I just, trying to keep a 12-year-old mind busy, trying to be inventive around how can I find more coins, more silver, more precious metal? And I'm sure I mentioned it to my parents. I think I wanted a metal detector. So, it was a gift, whether it was Christmas or birthday or what have you, and ended up, I got one, great. And then I opened the box and it was in parts. Honestly, everything right down to the circuit board and the transistors, I had to assemble the whole thing.
So you got a crash course in soldering.
Yeah. I just to full decomposition, everything was in parts, had to understand the transistors, how they laid into the board, the crimping, the soldering, the wiring harness, and the harness didn't come in one piece. It was just a bunch of wires. Fortunately, they were color coded. Set the whole thing up, soldered it all up, put the harness in, assembled the body, and wouldn't you know, in that first connection, when I hooked it up to the battery, it worked. I wasn't necessarily hooked, but, I had a little bit of pride around the fact that there wasn't a redo. I didn't have to troubleshoot, and I actually got through it in that first try.
You got version 1.0 out the door.
There you go. It was beyond MVP. It was full functioning and end state.
Nice. So did you actually end up finding a bunch of silver with this thing?
Yeah, it was, again, you never know in hindsight what you're thinking at 12 years old. Did I use it? Yeah, absolutely. Did I find anything? Yeah, bottle caps on the beach, but it never found any precious metals or anything of significant value.
You get to middle school, are you kind of working with your hands some more in metal and wood shop?
Yeah, absolutely. Extremely left brain logic, very little right brain creativity. In hindsight, what I was dealing with at that age. And what I found was, and I've found out over the decades, is if there's any life therapy, it's, kind of exploring the right side of my brain. So the left side was always kind of dominant, really just taking over. I had an affinity for working with my hands, working through wood shop, metal shop, and just continued on in that vein and found out that I had a pretty good bent or engineering mindset. Yeah, based on that.
You got into computer-aided drafting, or was it hand drafting?
No, it was all drafting. And I had kind of extrapolated or took what I had learned, working with my hands and literally put pencil to paper in a drafting course and ended up putting together essentially a cutaway view of construction of a house with the stud plate in the wall, everything coming in, all the joinery coming in, and I put it together, foundation, etc. And the teacher took an interest in it. I'm like, well, it's just what you asked me to do. And, he says, well, do you mind if I put it in for, one of the school competitions, the trade show? I'm like, yeah, sure, go ahead. I was probably said it in a begrudging way. I was kind of extremely quiet, stoic. And wouldn't you know, I won. He says, well, that kind of gets you entry point into one of the regional contests. Says, you want to go in? I'm like, begrudgingly way. I might have said no up front, and he kind of coaxed me into it because you had to go and stand by your piece. It was a trade show, regional show, agricultural schools, regional schools, maybe a dozen or so. And then, so I went and stood by my piece, and, wouldn't you know, they finish up, and I ended up winning that as well. So at the time I figured, well, I might have something to go on here, a little bit of talent.
Yeah. And you had an interest in cars too. Is that how you end up working in the auto body business?
Yeah. So, around that time, I was looking for something other than working in restaurants, and I had an affinity for working with my hands, of course, and, ended up pairing up with just a wonderful mentor throughout my life, a guy by the name of Chuck Texera, who actually taught auto body at Newton North High School. He had owned his own shop, really just smart guy, kind of a veteran at everything in life. He took me under his wing working, whether it was after school or summers, and he taught me auto body, everything from the chemical makeup of the paints, the hardeners, some of the polyisocyanates that go into it with the hardening process, all of the brazing, all of the welding, the articulation of, how to flatten and straighten and shrink metal. So it was really a great experience, something that I really looked forward to doing and took a lot of pride in the outcome.
Kind of wish I'd had that class at my high school.
Yeah.
So you go into the business. What are you doing working on cars back then?
I leaned into it really hard, put a 57 Chevy together, and a lot of pride coming out of that. What I probably should have done is I did take a detour. I went to a community school, and back in the day, there might have been two majors on computers, one for computer science, but the one that I certainly didn't gravitate to, but I picked was data processing. Kind of took a detour away from cars in my late teenage years and jumped into technology before I ended up dropping out of that community school and got full-time into technical body repair.
And where do you end up working?
Yeah, so Chuck took care of me. He set me up at a local shop, a friend of his, private shop, did a couple years there, moved up really quick, ended up being probably the lead painter. He ended up bringing in his own mixing setup, so I'd be in there almost like a chemistry major, mixing paints, getting them tinted, doing matching and so forth. Found out that I had a pretty good affinity for it, started to get into some heavier collision work, and just, like all things in life, you want to do more, be more, make more money. And I ended up moving over to a Lincoln Mercury Mazda dealer.
You work at a couple different car dealerships, but then you're kind of coming to a point where you can't really see that next level, right?
So I end up, running this huge Chief frame machine, cutting cars in half, putting them back together. Ended up going to a Ford Volkswagen dealer. And within 6 months, I'm managing the place. I'm 23 years old. I end up picking up my auto damage appraiser's license. And I did that, and I did well. I did very well. I bought a couple houses. I bought my own shop where I'd work and, turn cars over. And I just realized that it's a corrosive environment, like the polyisocyanate hardeners. The base of that is cyanide, right? It's not something that you want to be breathing in at all, never mind every day. Just environmentally, it wasn't where I needed to be. I needed to get out, and I made a beeline for financial services.
So where do you go from there?
So, quick story, I was a big hockey player and playing in the men's league. A friend of mine, Artie Georgantis, worked at Putnam. And I, said, I'm kind of thinking of getting into financial services. And he's like, well, why financial services? I'm like, well, that's where the money is. I want to make money, like Willie Sutton, the bank robber, right? Well, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is.
Are you studying to pass your exams as well?
Yeah. Series 663. The heavy one was the Series 7 full securities license. They wouldn't sponsor us for that because we weren't necessarily a brokerage house. They just wanted you certified so that you could not give financial advice, but react to financial questions. I had a great time learning the mutual fund business really from the back office forward, and then took an interest in some of the investment side as well.
Did you have to hide your Boston accent there?
Yeah. After, on day one, probably every other person that didn't call from the region asked me where I was from because they couldn't understand a lick of what I was saying. And it was in that seminal moment back in the early 90s that I realized I need to start pronouncing my R's like R's.
That's a darn shame.
You are listening to the Underserved podcast. Underserved is produced by Syrinx, the developer-founded, developer-run software consulting company. For more information, visit Syrinx.com. That's SYRINX.com.
So you're also doing some macros in Excel back when like Lotus 123 is big?
So this is the early 90s, and this was pre-Microsoft Office, right? at the time, Quattro Pro and Lotus 123 were the lead dogs. Microsoft Excel was out there, but it certainly wasn't, the triumvirate within Microsoft Office. And one of the leaders of the contact center sent an email out saying that they needed someone with programming skills because they needed to take information from the telephony bridge system and get it into output reports. So I'm like, I used to be a programmer, I guess. I did basic Fortran, some COBOL back in the day. And when I had done my first pass, I was pretty proficient at it. So I'll opt in. Let me give it a try.
And is that where you first learn about NSCC?
Yeah. So what I ended up doing was I demonstrated some level of proficiency to the organization with respect to what I had done on the bridge system and pulling reams of data and, creating ranges and pulling together and, creating the reporting for the management. There was an opportunity over in the system support and development area at Putnam in the back office. And the National Securities Clearing Corporation, NSCC, was the backbone of that. It's essentially a freeway for, sending information, whether it was the FundServe system, ACATS, the networking system for maintenance of accounts, back and forth between the broker-dealers and the fund groups. I took a liking to what I was doing on that bridge system in telephony and then ended up getting kind of recruited for that system support and development job in the back office.
Is that where you were first exposed to data warehousing too?
Yeah. So what happened at Putnam, I was probably there for 5, maybe 6 years. And one of the big consulting groups had come in and they were implementing a data warehouse. There's 2 pieces to it, right? There's getting it in, which is kind of simple, and then getting it out. Oh, by the way, how are you going to make sense of what you're pulling out? You're putting it in there to get it out. So you've got a consolidated warehouse, or nowadays data lake, to make sure that you can mine the data, make the right organizational decisioning. And so I got tapped on the shoulder to head into the main office at PO Square. And I walk into this room and there's, 5 or 6 different suits, a couple $100 an hour, Accenture consultants. And they kind of put the lights on me, like, you need to unwind what this data is. And wouldn't you know, I pretty much nailed everything. I had an answer for it. I was able to take oceans of data and create, almost cardinal directions, like lines of sight out of it in an effort to just take information that was previously used for just operations and actually use it for decisioning, mining, business intelligence, essentially.
That's cool. What makes you move on to evergreen investments?
Like all things, you want to move on, you want to move upward. I was always about in the journey versus the destination paradigm. I just wanted to get there. I wanted, an AVP title. I had moved up at Putnam. I was managing the NSCC area, and there was a position that opened up over at the old Keystone Funds, now Evergreen. So there was an NSCC position, and I know the NSCC inside and out. I'd represented Putnam organizational, some regional boards, and had done a little traveling to back office brokerage firms and had a bit of a name. So I opted in, ended up being there for a couple of years, took on another group, an advanced applications group, where we developed a client server remote trade entry for some of the capital markets organizations down at First Union in Charlotte. So that was kind of my transition between Putnam and then Evergreen.
And so you stay there through Y2K, but then you wake up in 2000 and what do you think?
Yeah, you've got a good memory. So what I had done there in an effort to, kind of always extend myself, I had opted in and co-chaired the Y2K at Evergreen. Evergreen was one of those places that I had this realization at the time that there's 2 things to the way that I view things. There's what you do and there's who you do it with. And it was in that moment at Evergreen where I realized that, I understand the NSCC inside and out, but I'm not working with the people that or making my life easy or making my career fulfilling. I needed to move on. I had made a ton of friendships at Evergreen, specifically someone by the name of Paul O'Connor, who I brought over from Putnam. He and I co-chaired the Y2K there. And I wanted to see that through. So when I walked into Evergreen, I knew on week 2 it wasn't long for that, but really needed to move on. I wanted to commit to the Y2K piece because there was some level of infatuation that I had around how this simple little 2-digit versus 4-digit date thing could pretty much interrupt the world. So I stuck that out and ended up opting in over at Investors Bank and Trust just because I needed to get out of Evergreen. And I was just looking for a greener pasture.
That was like the heyday of IBT, right? Like great time to be there.
Oh, goodness. So IBT, Investors Bank and Trust, was a publicly traded company. It was an organization that had been in place for a couple decades by the time I had got there in early 2000. And it was actually a startup, maybe spin-off of back office capabilities for institutional players. And what I ended up doing is opting in there, and it just became, on a bad day, it was great. And on a great day, it was magical. It was this organization where everyone pulled their weight. It was small enough to make a difference, a big difference, but big enough that you would never get bored. There was camaraderie, there was teamwork, there was all kinds of events for folks to kind of share in, a really neat culture. So it was to the point where I had identified with it so much that I think I might have had 4 promotions within 7 years. Started off, I took a step down. I think it was Chris Sullivan, stepped down to stand up. Same thing. I kind of have a similar pattern where I just needed to get out of Evergreen. I joined as like a senior business analyst, quickly moved to manager, managing a couple lines of business technology.
And that was all after they were bought by State Street?
Yeah. So leading up to 2007, so the heyday for me, and I think a lot of the folks that worked in my organization at Investors Bank and Trust, was probably leading up to that 05, 06, 07, where we had created a lot of traction. I've always said, the focus on turning traction into action. And we really did that as an organization. I was working for an individual by the name of Luke Chalone over in the Client Information Delivery Group, and he took to me pretty quickly, probably saw some level of capability, and I identified with him really well. And an opportunity had come up, or actually went to him, I didn't know about it, where they were looking for a technology manager over in the mutual fund administration area. And he threw my name out there, and they bid on it. And I'd never interviewed. I didn't have an option. I had to go over there. So I kind of begrudgingly left Luke, ended up over there, and wouldn't you know, things worked out really well. Kind of right-sized things and, flattened the learning curve, figured out the whole mutual fund administration. The name of the platform was InvestSmart, security master and reporting tool. Created some inroads with some of the line of business sponsors, got the technology platform right-sized and in place, moving forward, created a decent backlog, and was starting to move forward. And I've always had this notion that, I want to be able to build a technology organization that I can walk away from, not to walk away from it, but that I can build it, right? I can build on it. I was identified as someone that might be able to lean in as a transfer agency, and I had cut my teeth on the transfer agency over at Putnam. So layered that in, now running 2 lines of business, and then to your point, State Street crept in, and they bought us out overnight.
Unfortunate timing, though, because the financial crisis is coming down the road. What happens to you then?
Yeah, it was kind of that perfect storm of bad mojo. So, and the timing was absolutely right. They both hit about the same time. IBT was bought in the 2007 timeframe, probably closed early 2008. I had been retained by State Street for a couple years, kind of gave me the golden handcuffs to make sure that we could do the options analysis, bake off between the applications, and be able to manage through a lot of the data conversions. The financial crisis hit, and my personal crisis hit, where I just didn't want to be there anymore. So I started looking around, and my thoughts were twofold. There wasn't a lot out there, but the State Street buyout had tainted me enough that I took a pause. I needed to look at what I was doing and where I was in my life and what I stood for. Because at the time, I kind of had this dirty feeling where, well, all I really did was help the rich get richer. I mean, it's like, I need to do more. I need to bathe in humanity. I need to figure out who I am and what I need to do to move forward with my life.
I am altering the scope of the project. Pray I don't alter it any further.
Excellent. Let the scope creep flow. Keep adding features. To deploy the release, deliver first. You must.
I find your lack of faith in change management disturbing.
Missing your deadline is the path to the dark side.
If you or someone you know manages software development projects, we can help. Call the offices of Syrinx Consulting. Syrinx provides software consultants who hit the ground running to help you deliver right away. Our toll-free number is 888-579-7469, option 1. Or you can live chat with Berg at Syrinx.com. That's SYRINX.com.
Syrinx is not a law office and this is not legal advice. Offer valid only in the United States. Hablamos español, pero solo un poco y no tener ni pies ni cabeza. Saludos.
What's step 1 for that? What do you start doing?
Yeah. So I had read a quote by Muhammad Ali where service to others is the rent we pay for room while we're on this earth. And that had resonated with me. And when I bumped that up against my earlier comment around help the rich get richer, it's like, if I passed tomorrow, what would be on my gravestone? And I had a strong preference or a demand for the latter. I needed to do something with my life. And service was the key word. service to country, service to community, where they were in that order. I tried to get into the Marines. No go, I'm too old. I'm like, well, Army's 42. Maybe I can walk my way in there, and I'm like a year too old.
Not to brag for you, but in your mid-40s, didn't you score a 300 out of 300 on the Army fitness test?
Yeah. So what I ended up doing was to manage some of the stress at the time around the financial crisis, the layoff. I ended up really getting into uber shape, running road races. I think in 2008, I might have run 50 road races. I was running at least a marathon a year. I ended up running 6 of them. Just, hitting the gym, working out was kind of my life partner. I woke up a Saturday morning and I'm going to take the Army fitness test, which was within 2 minutes, how many push-ups, how many sit-ups, and then run 2 miles. And don't quote me on it, but I think it was 77 push-ups and maybe 80 sit-ups, and then run a sub 13-minute 2 mile. And, not only did I do it, but I did it based on an 18-year-old scoring. I was in phenomenal shape at the time, and I wanted to parlay that into service to country. I'm too old, couldn't get into the Marines, couldn't get into the Army. And I ended up saying, well, what's the next rung down? Service to community. So I made a beeline towards that.
Did you try to become a police officer? Or?
I took the police, I took the fire exam, scored high, really high on both. I was way too old for Boston Police. That was 35, and I'm 43. Fire doesn't discriminate, so I took that. I scored high. I think I got a 99 on that. And then I realized that as well as I did, anyone that scored a 99 that was either an EMT, paramedic, or ex-military was automatically ahead of me. So I said, well, I'll be an EMT.
So how do you do that?
Like most things in my life, crash course, like uber focus. I went to Northeastern in 8 weeks. Took a crash course full-time, all frontline medical care working, EMT, everything that you can imagine with respect to the overall frontline healthcare worker, emergency healthcare worker vocations, all the studying, making sure that I understand everything with respect to all of the protocols that are required, and then making sure that I could demonstrate all of that. I ended up passing my EMT license here in Massachusetts.
So are you on an ambulance doing 911 rides?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Talk about an adrenaline rush or a dopamine hit. Honestly, Andrew, sometimes I wake up in my life and I feel like I'm Walter Mitty. I'm just these things that I've experienced, which in my mind, arguably, maybe a technology executive at a big bank to driving an ambulance, code 3, lights and sirens, thumping chests, managing car accidents, delivering a baby. It was an amazing experience. But what it did is it helped me get in touch with humanity.
Where'd you have to deliver a baby?
I was on a 911 shift, and we were posted up on the Swampscott town line, and my partner and I were called for a medical emergency. We drive down the street, we walk in, red lights, blue lights, all kinds of emergency folks swarming the house. My partner and I walk in a dimly lit hallway. There's a small bath. Poor young mother on the hopper. She wouldn't get off. She was scared to death. My partner, Aaron, ended up coaching her off. And the crazy thing about delivering a baby is it's that odd paradigm when you show up and there's one patient and then 15 minutes later you have 2 patients. So what do? It's like eating the elephant, one bite at a time. You split up. You take the mother, I'll take the baby. She took the mother, and she was actually an RN. She did a phenomenal job. We were so ill prepared from a timing standpoint that what I learned is it's a really sad, extremely sad paradigm when the help needs help. Whatever you do, always keep yourself safe. The baby came so quick. I dressed Aaron in, gloves, shield, mask, the gown, apron. I never had a chance to get dressed. I ended up sending a policeman, then 2 firemen out for the OB kit to the ambulance. They couldn't find it. I ended up running out. By the time I get back in, the baby's coming. I dress Aaron. I end up taking the baby, and actually, I hate to say it, but I ended up taking a shot of amniotic fluid in the mouth because I wasn't ready. The baby came that quick. I had, been there for my son's birth, but I wasn't responsible for it. I didn't have to know what an APGAR score was, never mind actually assess a baby. I actually managed that child's life. There was a baby boy named Riley that I had to manage him into this life. So it was in that moment where I had realized that this is what it's all about. This is that immersion into humanity that I really needed. Now I can have something on my headstone that in my mind is worthwhile with respect to what did I accomplish in life.
So perhaps too much excitement at times. Citizens Bank comes calling and makes you an offer you can't refuse.
Yeah. Being an EMT was certainly a grounding and really something that I wanted to do for the experience. And it was just one of those situations, debits and credits in the checkbook. It's like, I probably need to get back to making some money. I got a call from Citizens Bank through a friend of mine. They were looking for a senior program manager. And I ended up in a couple interviews convincing them that I was the person for the role, and ended up accepting a job over at Citizens Bank.
What sort of systems are you supporting over there?
It was anything and everything. It was all consumer, which kind of belies what I was hired for. I was hired over in the commercial side. But before I even started, they said, no, we have a huge initiative where we need to make sure that we're digitizing everything at point of entry at the branch, as opposed to packaging things up, trucking them over to a regional imaging center and so forth.
Is this like that thing where they slide my check through the scanner?
There you go. Yeah. Right. On demand, on location scanning right there. So ended up getting pulled into that. I ended up supporting pretty much every vertical in consumer. But what I was directly tethered to was the buy now, pay later business, all the merchant financing, which had become the rage, especially within the banking sector, as to who's fighting for that.
Is that how you end up working on a product around the iPhone 6 launch?
Yeah. So this goes back to 2015, where Citizens had been approached on an NDA basis for financing of pretty much any and all Apple products. What they were looking for was a partner that could do card agnostic. It could be any credit card. You want to be able to swipe the card and be able to create payments across a 2-year period. And I got engaged in managing all of the internal pieces within Citizens on that. There was a triumvirate of organizations. There was a vendor that was on the front end accepting the inbound request for the credit check and all of that. It was a back-end servicer. And then we need to, again, it came down to the data. It kind of transcends my career, where it's all about the data. I had responsibility for putting in the MPLS circuits back and forth between the back-end servicing vendor and Citizens, as well as the VPN tunnels, making sure that we were unwinding some pretty complex segments and some COBOL copybooks, getting everything processed, getting into our data lake, and obviously getting it out, getting it operationalized, and managing through all of that. It was a really great experience for me having to work directly with Apple, especially in the later years, on some of the load and performance testing. So yeah, that was probably the flagship item that I'd worked on when I was at Citizens.
But you're there for quite some time, over a decade. How does your life change Friday, March 13th, 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic shuts down the United States?
For me, I've got asthma, right? So I was like everyone, unknown, scared to death. Oh, my goodness, it's a breathing disease. I'm not in good shape. I'm not, young. I can't get this thing. Everyone went remote, still at Citizens, doing what I do, kind of making hay. And at the time, there was a host of folks that had come over from American Express within technology over to Citizens. That was a massive exodus. And a lot of those folks ended up over at Citizens. I learned a lot from those folks. I was working for a great guy, good friend of mine, Art Tramutolo, and we went remote. I let a couple months go by because Governor Baker had put an executive order out to give all frontline healthcare workers their licenses back, whether you were a retired nurse, LPN, phlebotomist, EMT, paramedic, you name it, to help with testing, right? There was no home kit testing. You had to go to a test center. And I was being badgered to come and unretire and help with the testing. There was just too many unknowns. I had concern for my own health and, my own family. I've got to take care of my family. So I passed until maybe June of that year. And then I ended up going to Art. I talked to my fiance, Robin. I talked to my sons. I talked to, my inner nucleus to say, I feel like we're in a global pandemic. I need to do my part. Built consensus pretty quickly. And wouldn't you know, I've got my colors back. I'm wearing my EMT uniform and I'm back out at these massive test centers doing all kinds of testing and quality control on the vials.
Now, you had a choice of where you were going to do this, right?
To some degree, I did. I invariably tried to go to the larger sites because I had an affinity for trying to manage volumes. No matter what I'm doing, whether I'm, QCing or oversighting or actually doing the testing, I wanted to make sure that I could kind of play big brother. Once we moved from testing over to actually vaccination, talk about the ultimate pivot from defense to offense, I had the opportunity to do vaccinations at either Gillette, obviously where the Patriots play, upper level community, or to the show's credit, the underserved area over at the Reggie Lewis Center over in Roxbury.
What's that like when you're first turning from defense to offense?
The feelings at the mass test centers was It was morbid. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was not a good feeling. There was fear in people's eyes. In hindsight, a lot of people that I saw that I wasn't aware if they had it or not versus what we know now. Now I can kind of make it probably 8 or 9 out of 10. I could guess who had it or who didn't, the virus, that is. Moving from testing to vaccinations, completely different feel. And when I look at what we as frontline healthcare workers did, we all pulled together, figured out what we needed to do to serve the masses. And I had a real connection point working directly with the underserved. It was just amazing communal humanistic feel where we've got folks lined up 6 feet apart, waiting their turn to get vaccinated and being able to give back and, kind of live that credo that I had mentioned around Muhammad Ali and, service to others, the importance of that, how I identify with that. It was just this great feeling to be able to give back.
And you mentioned flash mobs. Like, what happened while you were there?
Yeah. So the whole thing was a flash mob. It was just great. Everyone coming together. It was late on that Sunday. I mean, I was certainly tired, wasn't giving up, but continuing to pound through all of the vaccinations. When in a cordoned off area, a handful, in hindsight, they were probably students from one of the local music colleges, had plunked themselves down in this area. It could have been more than 5 or 6 of them. And in just perfect harmony, they struck up with a number of songs. The one that resonated with me was Ode to Joy. And it wasn't just me that stopped what I was doing. It was probably half the folks that were doing the vaccinations. Everyone in line turned their head. And it was just this completely humanistic feeling where everyone was in total harmony to the point where I could hear folks humming underneath their masks. So being in moments like that, kind of waking up after what I had been through in my career across technology, to be able to do things at such a low rudimentary level in giving back to the community, it was just a real special feeling.
Yeah, it's a triumph of humanity when you can feel everyone come together and march together.
That's right, yeah.
So you do end up going back to technology, but you want to take that idea of being able to help people and make it scale. So what do you do?
Yeah. So for me, at where I am, what I wanted to do and who I wanted to do it with, and I needed to take what I had learned during the pandemic. And I'm not judging. I just can't identify with the folks that dropped out during the pandemic. For me, it had the opposite effect. I want to lean in. I want to do more. I want, service to others. I can take my kind of rudimentary medical training. I can take my higher end capability set with respect to how to manage technology, and I can actually do more. So what do? I start looking around as to, do I go to, a plan provider? Do I go to just another area of the medical healthcare world? And what I had settled in on was Slalom. I wanted to focus on Slalom just based on, in general, there's a couple of streams or themes within consulting that tend to come forward. Financial services is one, government contracting is another, and then healthcare is arguably the lead. I thought that I could lean into that, take some of what I had learned or take some of the motivation that I had got out of the pandemic and lean into that, but be able to serve others at an upper level.
And be able to serve thousands of people at a time instead of one vaccination at a time.
That's right. Yeah. So, ramping things up, not incrementally, but exponentially. So I ended up leaving Citizens. I took a job with Slalom Build. I am there now and just kind of loving it. In many ways in my career, who I've worked with, I hate to sound tainted, but I always felt like, there's no green pastures, just how ochre are they? What I found was if I can kind of rekindle my IBT experience with who I'm doing it with, but most directly do it under that auspice of service to others, more directly healthcare, and I can do it within Slalom, specifically within the Build organization, that would be ideal. And I made it happen. I've been at Slalom, since earlier this year. My first 2 tilts out of the gate have been in healthcare, and I'm actually making it happen. I had listened to one of your previous podcast guests in healthcare. I don't remember which episode it was, and they had talked about Kairos API.
Nashin Mulana.
There you go. Great episode. Wouldn't you know? I've got intimacy with the API contract for Kairos. I worked on that. Epic is another one. DexCare is another one. It's one of those situations where, it's what I do and it's who I do it with. In this instance, this is pretty powerful to me to be able to lean into this vocation, being an agile coach, being responsible for pretty significant programs and delivery on behalf of Slalom Build, more directly their client base in healthcare, be able to understand the inner workings of this and be able to give back at that level. It's just exactly where I need to be at this point in my career.
How have you kind of carved out a niche in the technology industry, kind of combining your skills?
Yeah, I guess in hindsight, this is something that I've always done, but more awareness over the last, third of my career, where if there's this cross between line of business, whatever that is, technology, and then how you're implementing the technology, whether it's waterfall or agile, I've always found that where I make hay is staying ahead of understanding all three of those verticals very well, but always staying ahead of at least two. So if I've got to make sure that I can remain in sync with and deliver business outcomes, that I need to make sure that I have mastery of, in this instance, agile, as well as very good understanding, much better than our line of business on the overall technology infrastructure and platform to be able to solve for that. Same thing on the technology side, where I need to make sure that I've got a leg up on our technologists with respect to so that I can provide and provision the right servant leadership and direction over to them, as well as the line of business, to make sure that I can build trust with them, that we've got the right technology orientation, the right architecture in place. So it's kind of a fine line where I've got an omnipresent and constant focus around those three and have to transcend all of those three and have to move within all three of those verticals at any given time, but stay ahead of the other two stakeholder groups on the one that they're most unfamiliar with has really been something that I've been focusing on over the last dozen years or so.
Well, it sounds like a recipe for success.
There you go. Absolutely.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your stories and experiences with the listeners of Underserved.
Yeah, of course, Andrew. I really, really looked forward to coming in. Appreciate being here and being called in. So thank you very much.
And we'll talk to everyone soon on the next episode of Underserved.
Thank you for listening to the Underserved podcast. For more information on the topics discussed and for show notes, visit the show website, underserved.fm. And please be sure to rate, like, and subscribe to Underserved on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.